Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's Sundays at Home, a time for conversation, camaraderie, and discovering more about the women who have helped shape our world that have been largely underrepresented in our historical narrative. My name is Emma Rothberg, and I am the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum. For those of us who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended an NWHM program before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. The National Women's History Museum exists to preserve, illuminate, and share the powerful history of women in America, highlighting both the past and present as a contemporary virtual history museum. NWHM seeks to ensure that women's history is available and accessible to learners of all ages across the globe, and is working to bring a visionary new model of partnership to our nation's cultural institutions. In that spirit, the work of today's guests centers the importance of teaching women's history, particularly those who advocated tirelessly for women's equality. Before we begin, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel in the days following the event. Today's guests are available to answer your questions, so please use the Q&A feature on the tool ribbon to ask any questions that you may regarding the presentation. You may submit your questions at any time during the presentation. You are also welcome to use the chat feature if you have any comments throughout the program. In a recent poll conducted by the Associated Press Newark Center and the National Women's History Museum, researchers found that though most respondents believe some progress has been made in providing equal treatment for women, men saw more progress towards achieving equal treatment for women, with 61% of men saying a great deal or a lot of progress has been made, compared with just 37% of women who feel the same. Much of these questions surrounding progress center on Title IX, which protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. The work of today's guest centers Patsy Mink's courageous but often overlooked efforts to pass Title IX, while considering the continuing legacy this landmark legislation has established. Patsy Takemoto Mink was the first woman of color and the first Asian American woman elected to Congress. Fierce and Fearless is the first biography of this remarkable woman who first won election to Congress in 1964 and went on to serve in the House for 24 years, her final term ending with her death in 2002. Mink was an advocate for girls and women, best known for her work shepherding and defending Title IX, this legislation that changed the face of education in America, making it possible for girls and women to participate in school sports and in education more broadly, at the same level as boys and men. Mink's life is wonderfully chronicled by eminent historian Judy Wu and Gwendolyn Mink, Patsy's daughter, a noted political science scholar and firsthand witness to the many political struggles that her mother had to overcome. Featuring family anecdotes, vignettes, and photographs, Fierce and Fearless offers new insight into who Mink was and the progressive principles that fueled her mission. Wu and Mink provide readers with an up-close understanding of her life as a third-generation Japanese-American from Hawaii, her childhood on Maui, to her decades-long career in the House, working with noted legislators like Shirley Chisholm, Bella Abzug, and Nancy Pelosi. They follow the evolution of her politics, including her advocacy for race, gender, and class equality, and her work to promote peace and environmental justice. I'm joined today by two very special guests, Dr. Judy Wu and Dr. Gwendolyn Mink, authors of Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takemoto Mink, First Woman of Color in Congress, published in May 2022, and Emily Martin, who will moderate this afternoon's conversation. Our moderator, Emily Martin, is the Vice President for Education and Workplace Justice at the National Women's Law Center. Emily oversees NWLC's advocacy, policy, and education efforts to ensure fair treatment and equal opportunity for women and girls at work and at school, and to forward policy frameworks that allow them to achieve and succeed, with a particular focus on the obstacles that confront women and girls of color and women in low-wage jobs. Prior to joining NWLC, Ms. Martin served as Deputy Director of the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, where she spearheaded litigation, policy, and public education initiatives to advance the rights of women and girls, with a particular emphasis on the needs of low-income women and women of color. She also served as a law clerk for Senior Judge Wilfred Feinberg of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and Judge T.S. Ellis III of the Eastern District of Virginia, as Vice President and President of the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York City, and previously worked for NWLC as a recipient of the Georgetown Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship. Ms. Martin is a graduate of the University of Virginia and Yale Law School. Next, We are grateful to have Emily with us today to moderate our conversation. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Gwendolyn Mink. Mink is my apologies. Mink is a policy scholar who writes about poverty issues, gender issues, and equality politics in the United States. She is Patsy Mink's daughter. She was professor of politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz for 20 years and the Charles N. Clark Professor of Women's Studies and Government at Smith College for 7 years. Since 2008, she's been an independent scholar based in Washington, D.C. Mink has written or edited 10 books, most recently Ensuring Poverty, Welfare Reform, and Feminist Perspective, co-authored with Felicia Kornblum and Judy Wu. Besides her scholarly pursuits, Mink is engaged in social justice initiatives. For 15 years, she sat on the board of the Institute for Public Accuracy, a media democracy project. She's entering her 20th year as chair of the Patsy Takemoto Mink Education Foundation for Low-Income Women and Children, a nonprofit organization that provides support to low-income mothers who are pursuing education or training. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Judy Wu. Wu is a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, and director of the Humanities Center. She received her PhD in US history from Stanford University and previously taught at Ohio State University. She authored Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards, The Life of Wartime Celebrity, and Radicals on the Road, Internationalism, Orientalism, and Feminism During the Vietnam Era. Wu is also working on a book that focuses on Asian American and Pacific Islander women who attended the 1977 National Women's Conference. She co-edited Women's America, Refocusing the Past, Gendering the Trans-Pacific World, and Frontiers, a Journal of Women's Studies. Currently, she is a co-editor of Women and Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000, and editor for America Journal. She also serves on the editorial board for the University of California Press and the US and the World series with Cornell University Press. She's the co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Emily, Gwendolyn, and Judy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to be in conversation with you both today during this anniversary week for Title IX. So you obviously each come to the subject, this book, a little differently in how you came to know Patsy Mink. What inspired each of you to write this book and tell her story? Wendy, you want to start?
I can start. I can say that I was assigned responsibility for writing her biography by my mother at some point many decades ago when I had just published my first book. She sort of looked at the book and said, "So you know how to write books, you can write my biography." And we never had a particularly, sort of deep conversation about what that would mean or what it would look like, but it always sort of was in the back of my mind as a thing that I would try to do or try to make sure got done. After she passed away, my father and I donated her papers to the Library of Congress. And after the Library of Congress organized her rather massive collection of papers that dated from her childhood through her service, which ended with her death in 2002, I began to probe the documents, the collection, to figure out how I might proceed in writing a book. And in the course of that process, I had the blessing, the magical moment of meeting Judy Wu, who was herself embarking on this project.
And Judy, what inspired you to undertake this work?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Wendy. I just wanted to let folks know I'm a little bit under the weather, so I can't quite hear as well. So if you think that I'm too soft or too loud, please let me know, and I'll try to adjust my volume. I had always heard of Patsy Mink because she was in Congress, and for an Asian American woman to be in Congress, I think was it was unprecedented. She was the first one, and she was the first woman of color. But I came from a field, Asian American history and also women's history, that tended to look at the 1960s in terms of grassroots activism. So thinking about the everyday people, the ways in which they were impacted by structures of inequality. And so it was a little bit out of my comfort zone in some ways. And I think for those fields to think about women who are in official positions of political leadership. But that's what fascinated me. I remember 10 years ago looking for a new project because I was wrapping up my other book. And the Library of Congress was featuring the Patsy Mink papers. And I realize now that it must have been because it was the 40th anniversary of Title IX. And as a historian, it's such a treasure trove to be able to have access to archives. I didn't realize how full the archives were. There's more than 2,000 boxes. Maybe it's even closer to 3,000 boxes. But I started going to Washington, D.C. At the time, I lived in Ohio. I could drive over there, took 7 or 8 hours. And early on, people told me you should really get in touch with Wendy Mink and talk to her about this project. So we began just by meeting and talking to each other. I started doing interviews with her. But when I found out that her mother wanted Wendy to write her biography, it just didn't seem right for us not to collaborate and to work together. And I think we had to figure out how to do that because we wanted to maintain different voices. And that's something that's so beautiful, I think, about the book is that each chapter begins with Wendy's memories, these vignettes about her life, her family's life, and then to be able to juxtapose that or supplement that with my historical analysis. It looks like Wendy might have disappeared. I know she had some internet problems before.
I'm sorry, my internet is acting up again. Sorry.
Glad to have you back. So Thursday of this week marked the 50th anniversary of Title IX, which of course was renamed the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act in 2002, shortly after her death. So tell us about the role that she played in creating Title IX.
Well, I'll start us off and then Judy can complete the story. It's a little bit in the weeds to talk about the actual legislative origins of Title IX. I would say that sort of standing back, it was probably a 5-year process of discussion and experimentation with different legislative vehicles that she and her colleague on the House Education and Labor Committee, Edith Green, engaged before Congresswoman Green included the language of Title IX in what was the Omnibus Education Act of 1972. That was a huge piece of legislation that contained many, many different elements, including the ban on sex discrimination in educational programs that receive federal funds. I think that both Green and my mother were inspired by their own life experiences as well as by what they witnessed. I think the particular spark that sort of incited the desire to figure out the legislative vehicle came in the context of reauthorization hearings for the Vocational Education Act in 1967-68. And I don't know if you remember the olden days or have heard about the olden days in vocational education, which was an extremely gender-tracked kind of program, right, where there was industrial training and various sort of masculinized forms of training for boys and men, and very domestic arts-related training that was tracked for girls and women. And both my mother and Edith Green were extremely frustrated by all of that. And I think that sort of was a reminder of the urgency of figuring out a way to establish an equality principle in education. In addition, there was the inspiration of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which contained Title VI, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race and national origin in programs that received federal assistance. And so that was kind of a model or a body of language that could be imported into the gender equity context. And that then meant that the real question was, A, building up support, and B, figuring out the proper legislative venue for achieving this goal.
Judy, any additions to that story?
I'll just add two insights. One is very much personal, that Patsy Mink really struggled through most of her life in being able to gain equal opportunities for education. This starts in the Hawaiian plantation context, in which she had the opportunity to go to what is considered an English standard school. But that was basically a linguistic avenue for racially segregating different students, because a lot of the plantation workers spoke Creole, Pidgin. They didn't necessarily know how to speak English standard. Patsy Mink was third generation. Her parents had been educated by missionaries, so she did have that capability. But her cousins, the workers, usually could not necessarily enter that type of school. And she talked about feeling alienated, not being recognized and seen in that context. And this type of educational exclusion reoccurs throughout her career. So when she goes to the continental United States, she's regarded as an international student, even though she's from a territory of the United States. This happens again repeatedly when she's at Wilson College, at the University of Nebraska. She actually met Wendy's husband, or I'm sorry, Wendy's father, Patsy's husband, at International House at the University of Chicago. And she was only able to enter because they had not quite filled their quota of international students. One of the really devastating experiences that Patsy had was applying to medical school in the aftermath of World War II. And she had really geared her educational career, her career aspirations towards becoming a doctor. But this is in the aftermath of World War II. Returning GIs or receiving benefits from the government for housing, for education. And at most 5% of medical school had women. And she was basically told that there was no room for her. And this is not something that she herself experienced, but generations of women, including Wendy's generation. I remember Wendy talking about applying to school in the 60s and being turned out because they said, we have already filled our quota for women. So I think that personal experience of exclusion really led Patsy to really push for Title IX. I think the other thing I want to make, the other point I want to make is political. One of our arguments in the book is to think about Patsy Mink serving as a bridge feminist. So someone who's in the Hall of Congress, but very much in dialogue with women activists, with women who've had experiences of exclusion, women who are thinking about how to use policy, how to use the tools of government to advocate and transform our broader society. And so that partnership was really crucial for thinking about how to not just pass Title IX, but to maintain its protections.
So one of the things that I heard in your answer just now, and that definitely comes through in the book, that as the first woman of color in Congress, Patsy Mink's commitment to gender equity was very closely entwined with her commitment to racial equity. So I'd love to hear more about how you each see that showing up in her work, both around education, but also as a feminist legislator more broadly. Judy, do you want to start?
Something that comes to mind most immediately was her advocacy for welfare reform. This is the 1990s. I mean, this goes back further in time because she's very much committed to educational and economic opportunity since the beginning of her political career. But certainly in the 1990s, when the Clinton administration, pushed by very conservative political leaders, were trying to transform welfare as we knew it. And a lot of the political rhetoric at the time was about blaming women of color for being bad mothers. And how can we punish these women and make sure that they don't take the dole of the government? And Patsy and her allies really had a completely different understanding. They were thinking about how do you solve poverty, which is very much aligned along the lines of gender, thinking about the gendering of poverty, and along the lines of race, the racialization of poverty. And so I think the types of policies that she was advocating for had a fundamental respect for women of color, for impoverished women, for impoverished mothers, not blaming them for poor life choices, but thinking about what are the sources of support that would allow them to live their lives with dignity and to allow them to support their children. So I think that's a key moment of advocacy that I think really puts on display, Patsy's intersectional understanding of feminism.
And Wendy, what would you lift up as examples of how your mother's commitment to gender justice and racial justice were really intertwined?
Well, I think the welfare reform example is probably the most crystalline example of that work. But I think that also, if you look at sort of her approach to sort of how gender equity in education should be enforced or implemented, you can see that she never really thought that Title IX was a solo project. She never thought that it would be enough to simply declare that there shall not be sex discrimination in schools that receive federal assistance. She thought that there needed to be lots of collateral policies that addressed the opportunity needs of women who had fewer resources, for example. So thinking about federal student aid was a very important piece of the gender equity idea for her. Thinking about transforming curricula so that the stories of all women would be told was an important part of her project for gender equity in education. That one was pursued primarily through the vehicle of the Women's Educational Equity Act, which she introduced, I believe, in 72, maybe in 73, which was getting at the content of education in a way not simply to represent sort of women in a generic sense, but to represent women in all of our diversity in the curricular project that is schools.
And going back to 1972, of course, the legislative story of Title IX doesn't end with it being signed in June 1972. It's also a story of defending those gains that were won against waves of backlash and retrenchment. So I'd love to hear from you both a little bit about that story, about what happened after the win and Patsy Mink's work to defend Title IX in the months and years that followed its passage. I don't know. Wendy, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, Title IX was a declaration, right? It was a declaration that the federal government was on the side of gender equity, of banning sex discrimination in education. But Title IX did not itself say how that would be accomplished. It did not say who would be covered by this principle. It did not say what even sex discrimination would be defined as being. Really. So the struggle in the immediate aftermath of enactment of this declaration was to operationalize the declaration so that it could be implemented and enforced at all of the levels of education that were supposed to be touched. From the period 1973 to 1975, what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was set on course to develop implementing guidelines, which meant providing definitions for lots of these questions and sort of spelling out the categories of inclusion under this new umbrella of gender equity in education. Over the course of those 2 years, or more, 2.5 years, many people came out of the woodwork to try to kneecap different aspects of Title IX, especially with respect to athletics, education, and athletics competition, physical education, sports teams, sports facilities, all of those sorts of things. There were forces at work, the male athletics lobby in particular, and their friends in Congress to try and carve out exceptions for these, at that point, masculine arenas, so that they would not be touched by women or touched by gender equity. So the first big struggle was to make sure that that carve out, that those loopholes were not permitted in the guidelines that were promulgated for the enforcement and implementation of Title IX. That comes to a head in 1975 and is decided ultimately in a way that protected the integrity of Title IX as a comprehensive measure respecting equality and paved the way for the dramatic changes in the participation of women and girls in athletics through schools, and then later through extracurricular sports activities. And then, of course, throughout the next ensuing decades, there were always challenges to Title IX. There were challenges to who was accountable under Title IX that came up in the 1980s, and we had a terrible Supreme Court decision with Grove City College versus Bell in the mid 1980s. In the 1990s, we had all kinds of challenges again about athletics, in the calculation of student interest, in the charges that started receiving a lot of public attention about how advances for women in athletics meant losses for men in athletics, right? This sort of zero-sum idea that equality for us meant loss of privilege for them. So, and she wasn't in Congress in the 80s, but certainly through the 1990s, she was there for all of those struggles when the wrestlers were complaining that Title IX was meaning that they were going to lose their teams. She was there when the challenges against the application of Title IX for sexual harassment and sexual assault ideas were being sort of backlashed in the 1990s. So yes, I mean, Title IX has been a terrain of struggle and continues to be a terrain of struggle. And of course, the danger is that someday, as we know is possible, we might lose that struggle and be back in the darkness.
Judy,
I was just
go ahead.
I was just going to add that Wendy's being very modest because there's been this fantastic short documentary that just was released, the New York OpDoc project. And one of the key people involved is Ben Proudfoot, who won an Academy Award for Queen of Basketball. And Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, is an executive producer of this fantastic film. So I suggest that you look it up because one of the crucial episodes that happens, and I think it's so important for two reasons. One is that when Patsy was trying to defend Title IX from these different attacks, Wendy was involved in a car accident. And so Patsy spoke against these reforms, then had to leave. And so I think it really shows the struggle she had as her responsibilities as a mother and also someone who was a feminist advocate. There's a beautiful quote that we have in the book, which I don't quite have the wording, but just something about how hard it is to be both a mother and a legislator. And because Patsy left, the negative that people were against and Title IX actually passed their reforms by one vote. And this is something I felt like the documentary didn't talk about, which is that there was a revote. But part of the revote was that all these feminist activists basically invaded the Capitol and pursued these legislators into elevators, into their offices. And some of those congressmen said, this is the heaviest lobbying I've ever experienced. And so this really shows, again, that kind of bridge feminist relationship, that it wasn't just Patsy, but it was all these women who were mobilized and said that we deserve these rights, we deserve these opportunities. And that helped led to a revote in which the antis lost. So I highly recommend the documentary. It's so beautifully done. And there's also a Newsweek, I think it's Newsweek, essay that Wendy recently published as well about this particular episode.
Yeah, it's a really compelling story, both from a personal dimension and because it's such an amazing example of advocates and Patsy Mink working together in a way that was incredibly effective. One history of Title IX, I think it was 37 words and not your book, but maybe it was your book, said that legislators were saying, I think there were hundreds of women there, and the advocates saying, I think there were like 20 of us, but we talked a lot. We were really talking. Judy, as you were going through these 3,000 boxes in the archives, this really rich history, what was your favorite thing that you found during your research?
There were so many fascinating aspects about Patsy Mink's career. She had a long history of anti-nuclear activism. And I think that really reflects the fact that she's from the Pacific, where many of these tests were done, and that she had this sensibility of being connected to the islands and waters of that region of the world. I think another favorite period that I have of Patsy Mink's life is when she's actually away from federal office. And she worked for a period of time with the State Department and also for Americans for Democratic Action, which is an organization that Eleanor Roosevelt helped to co-found. But she also returned to Hawaii and ran for city council. And I just think it's so unusual for someone to be so prominent and to operate at the federal level, the national and the international level, and for her to come back home and do the very same thing in her neighborhood. And I think that really showed her mettle. It showed who she was fundamentally, that she wanted to create change. She wanted to protect the environment. She wanted to advocate for childcare. She wanted to speak on behalf of working class communities and working class families. I just found that she was so consistent as a person. And this is during a period of life when she's not sure what she's going to be doing next. Like this is the end of her first term in Congress. And it's not clear what her future would be, but she was just so committed to political change that I find that to be so inspirational.
And Wendy, what was your favorite memory of your mother to write about for the book?
Oh, that's sort of hard to answer because each memory sort of, has this whole sort of concatenating story that makes me feel warm. So it's kind of hard to prioritize. But I would have to say that the most fun materials to go through and recall and think about and learn about and write about were from the late 60s into the early 70s, women's movement stuff, electoral politics stuff involving the Democratic Party and attempts to gender equalize representation within the party and the struggle to make the party take women's issues seriously, and all of that. Her encounter with Edgar Berman, who sat on the DNC's Committee on National Priorities, who sort of dismissed her call for the party to support women's leadership and women's issues. He poo-pooed her by saying publicly and out loud that women were incapable of leadership because of their raging hormones. And then when she complained about his attitudes, he lambasted her as saying that her anger.
Uh-oh. I think Wendy's internet has.
At his comments proved that her. Oh gosh.
You're back now.
Am I still gone?
You were frozen.
Back now?
You're back.
Okay. That's it. Anyway, so the whole raging hormones thing between 1970 and 1972 was pretty sort of horrifying, but funny in a way to relive and sort of encounter.
So as you both have done this work, have spent so many years thinking about Patsy Mink's legacy, I wonder whether there are lessons that you see from her leadership in current pushes for gender justice, and it seems like an especially compelling question at this moment during this week, which of course is not only the Title IX anniversary week, but a week of really appalling retrenchment and setback. What lessons do you see for where we go from here? Judy, do you want to start?
I could begin. Well, first of all, Patsy Mink supported the reproductive rights of women who wanted to choose to be home mothers, and also women who made choices that that motherhood was not time for them. And this comes from a personal experience. She was medically experimented upon when she was pregnant with Wendy. This occurred at the University of Chicago Hospital. At the time, synthetic hormone DES was considered beneficial for pregnant women. It was considered that it would help prevent miscarriages. A researcher at University of Chicago didn't think that was the case and conducted an experiment with placebos for some women and with DES for other women. They were not informed that they were part of this experiment, and both Wendy and Patsy only found out decades later. And DS has been associated with a range of health outcomes. So there are DS daughters and DS sons. So she herself experienced firsthand what it means not to have control over your reproduction. And this is something that she was deeply committed to. And I doesn't necessarily always talk about herself, but she did talk about this particular episode as part of a broader critique of the ways in which corporations, institutions make choices for women, but also for all citizens, the ways in which they introduce toxins, environmental hazards into our environment. And she was always someone who really deeply believed in the need for government regulation, whether it's protection, reproductive choice, or it's about the regulation of corporate practices. So I do want to share that. The other thing I wanted to share is that we begin in the book with the speech on Title IX. That was the 30th anniversary of Title IX when Patsy Mink passed away. And I see that there's a question in there about the WNBA. She was just so enormously proud of the impact of Title IX and the way it had transformed women's experiences in education, in sports. But she also pointed out that these opportunities could be taken away, and that there needed to be vigilance, there needed to be democratic oversight, there had to be political engagement by people who care about these issues and these opportunities, and that's something that we need to do. I think about her political career that she enters in the 60s when there's a much more conducive environment in terms of the war on poverty legislation, but her opposition to the Vietnam War. I think about her coming back in the 1990s when there's a much more conservative political environment, even if there is democratic leadership. And she persists, she keeps on fighting. And I remember talking to Wendy about this, especially during the welfare reform debates. And they knew they didn't have the votes. But Wendy said, it's so important to have that record of opposition, right? To show that there was not just one end result that could happen, that there were different ideas, there were different options. And I think that's so important for all of us to really think about. What are the political opportunities? What are the political options? How can we advocate for those? So those are kind of my two thoughts about what's happening now.
Wendy, what do you think the lessons of your mother's work and leadership have for where we find ourselves today?
Well, I think perseverance, definitely, as Judy is describing, is probably her chief legacy. Imagination and perseverance. But it's hard to boil that down to a concrete strategy for what we do going forward after the Supreme Court took away our rights, right? So I'm not quite sure what she would have to say today, but I know that she would be ready to engage with everyone who wants to be engaged to figure out the path forward. The only sort of similar experience that I can draw from in trying to sort of situate her in this particular circumstance was in 1991, 1992, when the Supreme Court was considering Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and people were very concerned that that the court would take that as the opportunity to overturn Roe. This was this is the Reagan-Nixon court. It had gutted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Clarence Thomas was on the court. People were very very concerned, and the most sort of proactive thing that people in Congress felt they could do was the Freedom of Choice Act, right? And they didn't do it then. Looks like they can't do it now, but advocacy along those lines of statutory guarantees and using the hook of federal funding for various health programs to ensure that medical entities or practitioners who receive those funds or benefit from those funds, in fact, offer women choices and so forth. That seems to be something that she would advocate. She certainly wouldn't, sort of pick up her marbles and go home. But I think this is a tough moment that even she would not have ready answers for.
One thing in thinking about where we find ourselves now and thinking about the work that was done then that I find fascinating in reading about Patsy Mink and her leadership and engagement around the passage and defense of Title IX in the 70s and otherwise is that the Title IX fight was really one of, I think, the first modern era examples of this kind of close coordination between congressional champions and a women's movement that was at that moment creating new organizations and structures and modes of participating in the political process. For example, the National Women's Law Center, where I work, also began in 1972, just a few months after Title IX's passage. And in many ways, the story of what that looked like is one that I find extremely recognizable based on my own work, the Law Center's work with policymakers and in coalition 50 years later, as we try to sort of bring together an inside game and an outside game in our advocacy. So I would love to hear from you both more about what that looked like and whether you think that Patsy Mink's status as someone who was in some ways both insider and outsider in Congress was important to the creation of that strategy. Judy, do you want to start?
I think that's such a great insight. And I think it's something that we talked about in the book as well, because in many ways, Patsy Mink was an outsider. She was a woman, she was a woman of color. She's from Hawaii, which I think for most Americans, they don't necessarily even think of Hawaii as part of the United States, as the examples of her being regarded as an international student demonstrate. And so I think that outsider status helped Patsy Mink really reimagine what the government should do, right? That the policies that she's formulating is for the people who have been outside, who have not been invited to the table. And how can she use her role in a way to bring those people to the table, to bring those ideas to the table? And I think, she's entering Congress in 1965. So one of the heights of the civil rights movement, the era in which we might describe as second wave feminism, although I have some concerns about those types of terminologies, because what do we do in between the first and the second wave, or between the second and the third wave, right? There's so many different ways that we can formulate that history. It's also at a time when the Asian American movement starts emerging. So she is in conversation with these different movements. And I think to think about this insider-outsider strategy is a way to also break down the ways that we tend to characterize second wave feminism. So there's liberal feminism, right? The fight for equality with law and economics. There's radical feminism that really thinks about the personal as political and how are we transforming our families, how are we transforming gender roles on a daily basis. But she's someone who's really, along with other women, trying to think about how do we utilize these different tools together and to not necessarily draw such separate lines about what is the right way forward. So I think it's a much messier political history than we have traditionally been told, or that has been told. And so I think this is a really exciting new way to think about the political activism of this particular time period.
Mandy, I would love to hear your thoughts about Patsy Mink's role as in bridge feminism, in bringing together the outside world of activism with her advocacy as a member of Congress and how she came to that work.
Well, I definitely think that Judy's description of her as an outsider to sort of mainstream American institutions by virtue of her gender and her race and her geographic origin plays a big role in sort of creating a receptivity to interacting with people who also are at the margins, although they are outside of the institution, and sort of fuels a commitment to not, simply accomplishing things for herself, but accomplishing things to bring folks inside, if not literally as people who are in office, uh, at least theoretically as people who are contributing concrete ideas that are taken seriously for policy deliberations. I mean, and part of what was so sort of fun for me in looking at the materials from the late 60s, early 70s is a lot of that stuff percolates in her papers. You can see the formation and interaction of the Women's Equity Action League, with advocates for gender equity in education, the formation of the National Women's Political Caucus, for example, which was definitely an inside-outside kind of thing with Shirley Chisholm and Bella Abzug and my mom from the inside, confabbing with women's movement activists and electoral strategists from the outside to figure out ways to create lasting institutions that would be levers on the two political parties, primarily the Democratic Party, going forward. So yes, I mean that was all part of what she did, and I think that who she was and where she came from and the ways in which she experienced the challenges of sort of asserting her own equality in a system that devalued her were important parts of that, of the consciousness that propelled her to sort of work as a bridge, to create bridges, to collaborate with her sister colleagues in Congress to bring people to the table.
And this week, we've seen a lot of attention to her legacy, including the release of the New York Times documentary you were describing, which is great. People should watch it. And on Thursday, the unveiling of a beautiful portrait of her at the U.S. Capitol. What do you each see as the most important parts of her legacy?
I'll just share that it was just so incredible both to be at the Capitol on Thursday as part of the portrait unveiling, and also Wendy was invited to celebrate Women's History Month by Speaker Pelosi's office, and both times Billie Jean King was there, both in March and in June, and she's such an idol for what she's done throughout her career, her activism. One of the lines that she actually repeated in both settings is that you don't understand inclusion unless you've been excluded, right? That experience of exclusion enables you to really understand what it means to be included. And I think that's such a beautiful insight. I think that really captures for a lot of people why they advocate and have such a commitment for equality and for justice. I also think that, I don't know if this type of recognition would have been possible if Speaker Pelosi did not advocate for these opportunities. She was certainly instrumental in March, and also Representative Chu, Judy Tzu, Mazie Hirono, Senator Hirono. I mean, they played such a key role in giving official recognition to Patsy Mink. It just means so much to have this, public recognition of her political career and all that she's contributed. So I was deeply honored. I was just a spectator, but I was deeply honored to be there for both settings.
Yeah, it was it's an honor and an affirmation of her life and her work that I think is beautiful and very uplifting. The main thing that I think about when I think about the portrait and the embrace of her project, really, that the placement of the portrait in the Capitol entails, is that I hope that it's not just sort of something that next generations view and take note of in passing, but something that leads them to ask questions about how this person got to do what she did, what did she do, what can we do to carry on that legacy. In other words, I hope that the portrait is not just sort of a form of honor, but also an inspiration to action and to further commitment to democratic endeavor.
I just want to add two more details. Once in March, when Speaker Pelosi was talking about Patsy Mink's career and all that she did in Congress, I heard this voice of affirmation to my right and looked over, and it was Maxine Waters. So I was like, and Maxine Waters has this beautiful story of attending the WNBA game with Patsy Mink and talking about how these tall, strong women had these opportunities to be professional athletes because of this very small, diminutive woman, right, Patsy Mink. And the other detail I was going to add is, I don't know if people have seen the portrait. It's really beautiful. I think the author's name is, the painter's name is Sharon Sprung. But one of the things that is really notable, first of all, Patsy Mink was beautifully dressed. And I understand from Wendy that that's one of their favorite pastimes, is shopping together. She's holding a handbag, and that's something that Billie Jean King commented about. Does your mom always carry a handbag? And Wendy said, actually, she did. But the other thing that she carries in the painting is this brief, right? This legislative file. And I just thought that was so beautiful, that this is her superpower, is that she's going to go off and make law.
That's wonderful. The last question I'll ask, and then we will open it up if there are questions from the audience, is whether, in looking back at the fight to pass Title IX and then the defense of Title IX in the years that followed, where Patsy Mink was, critical, was made all the difference. Whether you see parallels between those legislative fights and the policy fights that continue today, and what we should take from that if we do see real echoes from where we were 50 years ago and where we are now. Wendy?
Well, it's not the same situation because only 2.8% of Congress was female in 1972. And while we're not far enough along in representation by women in Congress, we are a lot further along than we were back then. And so we have a diversity of spokespeople. We have a wide band of ideas to push forward. And that gives me great hope, even though these are much darker times than the times that the folks who crafted Title IX and defended it in the early 1970s were living through. I mean, the early 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment, right, is passed through Congress and sent to the states. The Title VII is expanded to include workers in educational institutions and state workers and federal workers. And the EEOC is given litigation authority. I mean, these are like major advances for equality, for deploying the levers of equality through statutory mechanisms. We're not in that situation in 2022, 50 years later, unfortunately. So it's hard to do a kind of compare and contrast on those grounds, but I have to hope that with the expansion in the representation by women in Congress, that means we have an expansion of good ideas for how to carve a path forward, and the rest of us can participate and support and advocate and vote.
And Judy, do you see parallels between those fights and these, or contrasts, and what do you take from those?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear my son screaming in the other room. He's playing video games. I think about the grassroots activism that's really been mobilized for the last several years, and how much hope that gives me, that that when there is something that's a danger to our to those of us who have already been marginalized, and there are forces to try to continue to marginalize them and make them scapegoats, that when people take to the streets and they come up with beautiful slogans, clever slogans, that they have their physical presence known, that they have their virtual presence known, I think that serves as such a form of a political empowerment. And so I see that kind of potential collaboration between social movements and hopefully those who are making policy.
I hope so. I hope so. Well, thank you so much, Emma. Do you want to invite the viewers into the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been getting some questions in the chat, but I encourage all of you who have questions to please put them there, and we will, put them out to Wendy, Judy, and Ellie. So one of the questions that came in from Lois, I know you kind of touched on it, but this 2002 WNBA game, the All-Star game, and Wendy, your mom getting to go, could you speak more of that, what it meant to her, and that's what Lois is interested in knowing.
That was the celebration of the 30th, and around the time of the 30th anniversary of Title IX, and yeah, she went, and I believe Senator Birch Bayh also attended, and Senator Bayh was instrumental in the Senate, of course, for shepherding Title IX in the early 1970s. So it was a fantastic experience for her, either preceded by or followed up with a speech in the House of Representatives about the meaning of the Title IX anniversary to her. And in it, she sort of went through the process by which she arrived at the decision that something like Title IX was an urgent necessity, but then sort of finished up by sort of issuing a call to arms to the rest of us, to generations who would follow her, saying that the thing that worried her was that students wouldn't know about Title IX, wouldn't know that they have this tool to assert their own equality, and B, that not enough people would be mobilized to defend it against naysayers, against people who wanted to poke loopholes in it, against people who would want to reverse it or repeal it altogether. And so, she called for vigilance. So on the one hand, we have a celebration that she went to and had great fun at and appreciated. And on the other hand, sort of a very serious call to, to stand vigilant to protect this very important, this precious sort of equality guarantee against the forces that would take it away.
Thank you so much for that. And I know in terms of the importance and the legacy of Title IX, it came up in conversation at a university that I attended. It was incredibly important to the women on campus, and it was a huge source of advocacy for those women who were seeking response and accountability from the administration. So, in that sense, thank you to your mom for helping us get this. So another question that has come in was if you could explain the title, Fierce and Fearless. Why that title?
Judy's laughing, so she can start the answer, or maybe give the complete answer.
I was going to defer to Wendy because we had the hardest time coming up with a title. We had multiple other ideas, and Wendy was very diligent to come up with this particular one. She actually had got bracelets made for us with the title Fierce and Fearless, but we also had a third one, which was feminist. So Wendy, you better talk.
Yeah, no, we had a hard time. I can't remember what our original title was, but the publisher didn't like it. And so we had to bat around a bunch of different ideas. And the main thing was we wanted words that would capture who she was and what she did, right? And so ultimately, fierce and fearless are perfect descriptors, but so is feminist. And so we did want to include fierce, fearless, and feminist, which was too much for the publisher. So we ended up with fierce and fearless.
I don't remember where we heard this. I mean, I know that Nancy Pelosi just talked about this before, but I had seen it before too, is that no one could say no to your mother. I just love that about her.
Oh no, Laura, in one of the interviews of Laura Eford, her beloved legislative director, said nobody could say, the only people who could say no to her were my father and me.
That's
and
right.
Otherwise,
yes.
Yeah.
And I just love that, you know, she's faced many obstacles in her life, and she's saying, you know, I did not always win all my campaigns. I did not win all my issues, but she was going to be dogged and to try everything that she could. So I think the title really captures that spirit about her.
Yeah, and also if you look at the members of the House of Representatives held I don't know, special orders or something to memorialize her shortly after she passed away. And if you look at the speeches of eulogy and so forth, the word fierce comes up like, you know, every 10th line. So we know that we know that fierce is something that people who knew her recognize about her, for sure.
Thank you so much for sharing. So I guess along the lines of, you know, picking a title, obviously there's so many choices that go into writing a book, publishing a book, editing a book. So could you speak about, you know, something that didn't make it into the book that you still think is important to know about the story of Patsy and the story of the passage of Title IX?
Well, for me, this is not so much about her, but one of the issues that was really sort of centrally important to her, or a set of issues that were centrally important to her, were civil liberties. And she did a lot of work on you know, freedom of information, challenging executive privilege, you know, defending the rights of the press, and so forth, especially during the Vietnam period when the government wanted to suppress public information about the conduct of the war and decision making about it. And so all of that we couldn't, I mean, we had a word limit and we exceeded our word limit. And so we didn't include those, you know, that sort of strain of policy experience and commitment that she engaged. So, you know, somebody else hopefully will do that in a follow-up to our biography.
Yeah, her papers are so extensive. I still have not gone through everything that's there. And partly it's because as a legislator, you have to develop a position on every single issue that comes through Congress. And she was very diligent and did research. So I don't know, it was challenging, especially for the period of her second terms, 1990 to 2002. There was much more materials about that time period. It was fun going through the breadth of her papers to the extent I could. And you can see the changing technology and communication. So there was telefax, and then there were computer printouts that had those little holes on the side. It sort of became familiar to me, the different methods of communication. But there were so many issues that she was involved in. Someone I know is going to be looking at her involvement in creating national public parks in Hawaii. So her papers are a treasure trove. And we do talk about that in the book, that there's so many different aspects about her life and political career that other people can explore. And I really hope that they do.
So, I mean, I guess along those lines of that, there's so much that you didn't get to touch on in this book, and that Patsy was so involved in so many different issues and advocated for so many different things. As we kind of mentioned in the introduction, this is the first full biography of Patsy Mink. So why do you think that her story is less well known?
Do you want me to begin, Wendy, or do you want to begin?
Why don't you start?
I mentioned this earlier. I think she falls out of the historical narrative that we tend to tell about this particular time period and about historical actors. So if you're in Asian American studies, you focus on the social movements of that time period and the focus on kind of the working class, immigrants, right? That kind of history of exclusion. I think in your women's history, increasingly now there's more of a focus on political history, formal political history, but I think there's been a lot more focus on grassroots activism, right, prior to that. I think if you're interested in kind of formal political history, it's usually white men who are the protagonist. So she falls out of a lot of the ways that people tend to conceptualize these different fields. But it's not just academic, it's also popular culture. So the Hulu series Mrs. America, right, doesn't even have Patsy Mink as a side character. She's not even showing up. So I think it says something about the ways in which Asian Americans tend to be erased in terms of popular consciousness, both in popular culture, but also in US history.
Yeah, I think that I agree completely with what Judy just described. I mean, it's an erasure, basically, which I think ultimately is rooted in not thinking of Asian Americans as fully contributors to American society. We're outsiders. We might be subjects of xenophobia, but we're not subjects of our own history here in the United States. So yeah, there's a, I hope we start a sort of mental massage process of opening people's minds with this biography.
I was just going to add to that a little bit. This is something that Patsy Mink herself experienced when she was trying to become a political leader and trying to go to Washington, D.C. There were just so many dismissive comments made about her. These political coverage would focus on her looks or focus on her measurements. I mean, almost treating her as a beauty pageant contestant, as opposed to someone who actually has political ideas and want to provide political leadership. When she was giving a speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1960, the commentator said, "Oh, so kind of in a very humorous way, it's so funny to see this small Oriental woman, right, talking to her fellow Americans." There was very much a disbelief that Patsy Mink, as an Asian American woman, would have something significant to say about American democracy.
Well, let's hope that your biography and all of the attention that is surrounding this Title IX anniversary and the portrait and the op-doc start helping us confront some of that erasure that has happened for 50 years. So before we kind of wrap things up, is there anything final that Emily, Judy, Wendy, that any of you would like to share?
Please read the book.
Yes, people should definitely do that. And one thing that I find really hopeful as I read the book and as I've been reading about the passage in defense of Title IX in recent weeks is what may seem fairly obvious, but it's sometimes hard to realize the fact that as folks were having these fights, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. And that these were fights that were not at all predetermined as wins, and yet winning is possible. And so I have found it affirming and helpful to remind myself of that story. And reading about Patsy Mink's role in finding the space where winning is possible when that was not at all foreordained, I think is a really helpful thing to carry forward in this moment.
I love what you just said. I'm going to leave this session with hope. Yeah.
I agree. I think that's the perfect ending.
Well, then on that note, yes, please do read the book. If you look into the chat, there is a link to where you can purchase the book from one of the National Women's History Museum's favorite women-owned bookstores, Ivy Books. But yes, I just thank you, Emily, Wendy, and Judy, again for your time and for sharing these amazing stories with us. And it's our great pleasure to spend Sunday afternoons in conversation with you and other inspiring guests in our museum community. If you've enjoyed today's program, then please mark Sunday, July 10th on your calendars, where I will be leading a guest curator walkthrough of the National Women's History Museum's online exhibit, Parading for Progress, which focuses on the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade through Washington, D.C. Thousands of women took to the streets to fight for their right to vote during this parade, and it should be an exciting conversation. For a full list of upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Public Programs and Events tab at www.womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advance registration is required. So again, Wendy, Judy, Emily, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. I know our guests have really enjoyed it. So until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of your Sundays.
Thank you so much for organizing, and thanks so much
Thank you so much.
to the Women's History Museum.
Thank you.